morning, doctors. Thank you for joining us again. This is part 4 in our series of 5 pro tips for transitioning your practice. As we mentioned in our other vignettes, there's probably 50, there might be 500 different things that are important to you as you think about transitioning your practice, but we thought we would pick 4 or 5 really important ones that seem to come up in all of our conversations with doctors, whether they're selling their practice to a peer, to another optometrist, whether they're selling to a young optometrist associate in the practice, whether they have an offer to sell all of the practice, whether they're being approached by a private equity firm. So no matter which modality the transition may take, we tried to pick out 4 or 5 topics that we thought were important. This one, because I've had this discussion so many times with optometrists around the country, and can often be, I think it seems very obvious on the surface, but it has a little bit of an emotional quality to it, and sometimes that emotion gets in the way that can sometimes derail a transaction. And so when you think about your practice, there is a difference between the value of the optometric practice that you're selling and the equity that you have in that business. And so topic 4 is value versus equity. The best way to think about this, and it's very simple and very straightforward, is using, say, your own personal residence or a home that you've perhaps owned before. If you have a home in your community, and we'll just randomly pick a number here this morning to illustrate the point. Let's just say you and your significant other have a home, and your home has been appraised by a licensed real estate appraiser, or you're getting ready to sell it, and the bank has had it appraised for the new buyer's loan application. The home appraised for $500,000. And so the value of your home is $500,000. But let's just say that you still have $100,000 left on your mortgage. So when you sell your home to a new buyer, of course, the value of the home is still $500,000, but your equity in that real estate property is only $400,000, because equity is the value of the asset minus any liabilities that are attendant to the asset. So if I have a home that's worth $500,000 and I have a mortgage or a second mortgage on my home that totals $100,000, then the equity that I'm actually selling to a new buyer is only $400,000. And the exact same principle works in optometry, because when we do appraising, we use basically a model of EBITDA, which we talked about in our first segment this morning. EBITDA, as you know, is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So because in your tax return and then on your P&Ls, if they're being done in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, the payment of principal back to a bank or to a lender, principal is not an expense. The expense is interest. That is the cost to me, to the business, to borrow money over time. And so because the interest is the expense, not the return and payback of principal, so when you add the interest back into your calculation of EBITDA, you're looking at the business on a debt-free basis. So when I sell my practice and Tammy Suffolk at the Williams Group appraises the practice for $500,000, the debt is assumed to be clear at the time the transaction will take place. That's why in one of our sessions, in session 3 this morning, we discussed how important it is. I believe it's important that if I'm within 3 to 5 years of selling my practice, it is very beneficial to you, the seller, to put the most amount of money in your pocket, because this is such a big transaction for most optometrists. Try to have your practice debt-free at the time of the sale. If you're selling your practice and the practice has secured debt against it, you still owe the bank for a GDX you bought or an OptoMap you bought, or you updated the software in the practice, or you cosmetically updated, you recarpeted and painted and maybe put new frame displays in the optical dispensary. If there is a secured loan against those improvements, if your new buyer is buying the practice and is getting the practice commercially financed, then the commercial bank, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Vision One out in Sacramento, those financial institutions will most likely require that that debt is relieved at the time that the sale is made. So out of the proceeds, again, out of the $500,000, the debt, the secured debt against the practice will have to be paid off. And so what I'm selling to a new buyer and what I'm really receiving is my equity, not just the appraised value of the entity. Now, if I have at the time of sale, my practice appraised for $500,000 and the new buyer, whomever that is, has agreed to pay me $500,000 and I have no debt, no secured debt against my practice, then the value of my practice and my equity are 1-to-1. I have a practice that appraised for $500,000. I have no debt against it, then my equity is $500,000. But if my practice has some debt, and often, to be honest, in many transactions, there is still some amount of debt, generally usually small by the time a practice is being transitioned. But there have been occasions when someone did a remodel or bought all kinds of new equipment in anticipation of selling the practice. That debt will have to be cleared in order for me to sell the practice to a new owner. The other option, of course, is that the new owner can assume that debt, but from the agreed purchase price, from the value, if I agreed to pay $500,000 for the practice, and there's $100,000 of secured debt in the practice, if I take over that debt for you at the time of sale at closing, you are only going to receive $400,000 in cash, because the debt I took over of $100,000 plus the selling price, the $400,000 that I also agreed to pay, those two numbers obviously add up to $500,000. So if I take over any debt, I just reduce the purchase price dollar for dollar, and in the transaction world, that's the same amount as handing you $500,000. And as a matter of fact, the IRS will tax you on that. So try to understand the difference between the value of your business and your equity. It's a simple concept, but at the time of sale, many doctors assume that the debt on the practice will go to the new buyer. And if it does, it will reduce dollar for dollar your cash out at closing. Thanks for joining us today. If you have any other questions about this or any of the other topics we've discussed, there'll be some contact information at the end. We'll be happy to discuss that with you further. Thanks and have a great day.